Hello, good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this appointment with the Baby Brains Annual Conference. We're super pleased to have Professor Emily Jones with us today. Hello, Professor, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for accepting to speak to our audience. We are really glad to open our week of events with you. And the theme that we're going to see with you today is autistic experiences, experiences of parents with an autistic child during the pandemic. If you would like to present yourself and what you do at the Birkbeck University, and then I can just share the slides whenever you tell me that it's good.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm happy for you to start with the slides now if you want, and I'll introduce myself at the beginning and then go through. Brilliant. Great. So can you see my slides okay now?
Sorry?
Are my slides up okay?
Yes, I think we can see them well. Yes.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for attending. And what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about some of the research that we've been doing with families who have an infant and an older sibling with autism or ADHD in some cases. And we've been doing some ongoing longitudinal studies. So I'll explain a bit of background on the studies that we do and why we're doing them. And then I'll talk a bit about the impact that then COVID has had on the families that we work with as a way of understanding, a sort of snapshot of some of the broader impact the COVID pandemic might have had on families with older children with autism and ADHD and also younger siblings too, but also to think about how within the context of our study and others, we might be able to measure some of those effects. So I'm Emily. I'm a professor at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development in London. And this slide just illustrates some of the research that we do at our centre. So we combine both theoretical models of, how development occurs. So how do children learn? What kinds of things influence their learning environments? What things are important for their brain development? And of course, thinking about the pandemic, we're thinking about how changes in the experiences that children have had might be impacting their learning skills and their brain development. And to answer those questions, we use a whole range of different tools. So you can see on the right-hand side that there's a whole range of different ways of measuring what children know and what they learn. So we use some measures that are behavioural, where we might see if a child can uncover a hidden toy to know whether they understand that toy is still there when they can't see it anymore. We use measures of brain activity. So, for example, we have EEG in the middle here, which is a net of sensors that sit on baby's head and record what their brain's doing while they watch videos or talk with people. We have another technique that's called NIRS, which is using very weak rays of light, again, to measure patterns of blood flow around baby's brain, which again can tell us which bits of their brain are more active when they're doing something they're interested in. And we also look at things like genetics. So, what kinds of information is the child born into the world with in their genes? And we can look at things like arousal measures, so their heart rate, how fast is their heartbeat when they're anxious or when they're experiencing new things. That can tell us about whether they're a child who might be more fearful or less fearful. So we use this whole range of measures to try to understand early child development. And one of the conditions that we've been very interested in and working on for a long time is autism. And one of the reasons we're interested in autism is because it's a pattern of difficulties often that emerges in the first few years of life. But we know that parents are often concerned a long time before a child might get a diagnosis. And so often parents report that they first became concerned certainly by 18 months, sometimes earlier. But often children might not receive a clinical diagnosis until, school age or even older. And that can be particularly acute for girls or for children with a sort of different presentation. But we know that some of the factors involved in causing autism are there from birth or way before. So there's a lot of genetic factors involved and possibly also some prenatal environmental factors too that have a lesser impact but might also be important. And so we're really interested in understanding, are there ways we can understand the early development of kids with autism? Can we pick it up earlier so kids can get better support, and so that parents don't have to go through this sort of odyssey of trying to get a diagnosis and trying to know what's best to do, and so that children can, reach their full potential. And we know that at least detection of autism is increasing. So we're recognizing autism much more in the community. But often adults with autism still report that their quality of life can be poor. So many adults with autism still struggle to hold down a job or find employment. And there's lots of societal factors behind that really need to change so people can, have a full quality of life. And just for anybody who maybe isn't familiar with autism, there's a sort of set of diagnostic criteria, but there's lots of other things that might come along with autism, including lots of strengths. But in terms of the diagnostic criteria, it's often these two domains: difficulties with social communication, so making friends or interacting with other children, and then sensory difficulties and potentially some really intense interests. And you can see that for kids with autism or with related neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD, which often co-occurs with autism, the pandemic there's lots of reasons why it would be particularly challenging to be isolated, to be, suddenly removed from your school setting or from all your social supports. And we've been interested in whether this is having a differential impact on these children. And traditionally, the way that we've tried to understand autism and conditions like autism is by looking at kids who have a diagnosis already and trying to understand what might be going on in their brain and what might be different about them genetically, so we can try to understand, the full picture of what's happening. But we know actually that, like I said, some of the differences in kids with autism are going to be there even before birth. And so actually this child had a long developmental history of growing up in a world that they're processing differently, understanding differently, that they might be interacting with differently. And that's all going to have impacts on their ongoing development. And again, if we think about the pandemic and how that might interact with this, the environments that everybody is experiencing have also changed. So how is that impacting these trajectories? And so this is how we think of it. It's a sort of complicated picture, but basically, we know that the brain's going to be functioning differently from very early on. That impacts how a child learns from their environment, and the environment around a child and what they're learning from it then has cascading effects on their brain. So their brain changes and learns different things. And then that's going to have impacts on their genes potentially too. So we know that genes can get switched on or off based on the experiences you're having in your environment. So there's this complicated cascading process that we really want to understand, both for kids with autism, but also for children in general, as to how these differences in both the environment itself and how you experience that environment are going to affect your development. And so the kinds of studies we run are studies with infants who have an older sibling with autism or an older sibling with typical development. And the reason we do that is that we know that about 20% of infants who have an older sibling with autism will go on to develop autism themselves. So that means we can study them from infancy and look at what the earliest signs of autism might be and how that child is developing differently before they have a diagnosis. So we can work out what might contribute to that later diagnosis, or what might predict it and might help us to identify kids who need help earlier. And we follow these children plus groups of kids who have a typically developing older sibling, so we can compare, what we see in relation to what we'd expect. And we follow kids, from birth or sometimes even before, all the way through to the age of 2 or 3, where we can make a diagnosis for some children, or we can look at their traits, their strengths and weaknesses. And then we look back at the data we collected in infancy to see what happened earlier on. And mainly what we're interested in doing is, if you think about development as this kind of landscape and the child's development sort of progresses down one route or another, we're looking for what's happening when a child starts to go down a different path. So as they start to show behavioural changes associated with autism or ADHD, can we identify those, and can we work out how to make the environment for that child optimal for them so that they can reach their full potential? So that's the sort of broad context of our studies. And one thing that, we know is very important from a lot of research that we've done is social engagement. Because we know that kids learn a ton from watching each other, their cousins, their siblings, their parents. And it's something that's really, really important for brain development, as well as for, feeling connected and for developing those bonds that are really important. And so something that we've been looking at a lot in our studies is how interacting with other people is impacting brain development over time. And some of the things that we're finding and other people are finding too is that particularly for infants with later autism, those skills are quite vulnerable. So whilst in the beginning, they actually are very keen on interacting with other people and might spend a lot of time looking at faces and, engaging with their parents and with other people. Over that period, so from sort of 6 months to 3, you can see in this graph here, their social interest just kind of drops off. So they become less and less drawn to people in their environment, and they look more and more at objects or other things they might be playing with. And that's not necessarily bad, but it does mean that they're getting less experience with the kinds of information that people can give them. So language or showing them how things work or engaging with them. And there's some evidence that, kids might compensate for that and adapt in other ways. So they maybe jointly attend to something with their parent by looking at the joint activity rather than at the face. And so they're getting the same kind of bonding experience just through a different route. But again, these sort of very early settings and very early interactions are really important for how the child's brain's developing. And we've also found that when we look at the brain of infants with later autism, we can start to see differences in how they're reacting to social stimuli very early on. So in that context, then, we've been running these longitudinal studies since sort of 2008. And then, of course, there was the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're in a sort of relatively unique situation where we have a set of families where we've been working with them and following their kids both before and now after the sort of COVID-19 disruptions. And as we know, there's just been a broad, huge societal impact of this, from shut playgrounds, school closures, job loss, health impacts, all sorts of things. And so one thing we were interested in doing is figuring out for the families in our studies, what are they experiencing? And you guys, I think, will hear from a lot of other people who've done much larger scale surveys over this time. But the sort of benefits of our sample are that because our families were engaged before the pandemic, so people aren't filling out our questionnaires because they had difficulties or because they didn't, which you often get in sort of convenient samples where you're asking people to fill out a questionnaire for a particular reason. And so in some ways, this is potentially quite representative data, I guess, of at least the kinds of families that we're working with. But also, as you'll see right at the end, we can also look then at what we're actually seeing behaviourally with our children who we saw before and after, and whether or not there are any changes that may or may not be to do with COVID impacts. So I just thought I'd share with you briefly some of the results of the survey that we recently did. As I said, again, it's a relatively small sample, but their families, who are participating in our ongoing studies, we have lots of rich information about who they are. And this is part of what we call our STARS project, which we're still recruiting for, if anybody's interested. So we see infants who have an older sibling with autism or ADHD or typical development. And we also have a range of online studies at our baby lab too, if anybody's interested. The information's on our website. But the data I'll talk about comes from a proportion of this sample who had a baby during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then that child, has been growing up in this context. And so it's quite a long survey, but I just thought I'd share some of our sort of headline findings. And so over 75% of our families said that the pandemic had a slightly or very negative impact on their lives. And I think that, is consistent with sort of broader reports, but also reflects the fact that, families with a baby and an older sibling, had a particularly challenging time, I think, during this period. Importantly, 58% of families said that their children had struggled to adapt. Particularly, this is the older sibling, so the child who had a neurodevelopmental condition or mostly autism. And then there were some big differences between our families who didn't have a child with a neurodevelopmental condition. So 25% of our families who had a child with autism or ADHD were living with somebody classified as high risk. So that meant they would have to shield through considerable portions of the pandemic, versus none of our control families. And I think that reflects the fact that often conditions like ASD and ADHD run in families with other conditions too, physical health conditions, other things that would make you particularly vulnerable. And often, the level of family support required for that child means you end up with, extended families living together, which again means you have more vulnerability in the home. Again, a significant proportion of our families experience difficulty in getting medications for their children. And 50% of our families with a neurodevelopmental condition had experienced difficulty getting healthcare. So that's sort of a profound impact on, just the stability of their child's care. And then, of course, there were financial impacts too. So half of our families with a neurodevelopmental condition had a family member furloughed, which is much more common than our control group. I think partly to do with the job profile that people are doing, partly because I think a lot of people who had a child with a neurodevelopmental condition just needed to be at home more, and so furlough was a better option for them. 20% of families had difficulty getting essentials, 25% had difficulty paying bills, and 44% of families with a neurodevelopmental condition reported decreased income. And our families are across the SES spectrum. It probably skews a little bit towards families who are better off, but we do have quite a good representation across the income brackets. So that's, almost half of our families with a kid with autism or ADHD reporting a drop in income, which obviously creates huge challenges for the family. And then we also measured stress. So one of the big impacts, the sort of more direct impacts of all of this is stress on the family. And we found that stress was significantly higher in the families of kids with a neurodevelopmental condition, and also distress of the child was also higher in kids who had a neurodevelopmental disorder than typically developing children. So you can see here the sort of distributions across the scores. Higher scores here are more stress. So you can see the kids with a neurodevelopmental condition are just much more likely to be in those higher brackets. And so that's the kind of thing that, we don't know yet what impact that will have long term, but it's certainly very challenging for families to have to deal with. And then we also asked some qualitative questions about, what families were experiencing. And again, I think, these themes are very familiar from broader stories of the pandemic, but, lack of support was one of the biggest things that our families experienced. And that was something that, could have been done differently. Impacts on schooling, living conditions, family finances, and the sort of downstream effects of this was mental health difficulties. And we know from a lot of research that, mental health difficulties in parents can really make it hard to provide a solid environment for children. And requires support. And then for children, lack of routine was a really big issue, particularly for kids with autism. Homeschooling was hugely important in that it really disrupted children's routines, their access to services. And one of the big things here was that parents were really worried their children were lacking stimulation or social experiences. And if you think back to what I said at the beginning, that early social context is so important. This is the big thing that parents are worried about that's going to impact their children in the longer term. And again, these sort of mental health impacts are something that people are really concerned about. And so, the big question for us now is how is this sort of increase in stress and anxiety and distress in families, but also in children, going to impact these longitudinal trajectories? And we've only just started to look at this, and our work is really preliminary at this stage, but I just wanted to share one piece of data with you, and this is from our parent report data. So we asked parents about different things about their child. All sorts of questions, and they're sort of everyday questions, like when you have a bath, how much does your child like the water? How much does your child vocalize to you? And we looked at that across our data that we collected before the pandemic. So 5, 10 and 14-month-olds before the pandemic started, and then those same age points later. So these are different children, but children who did or didn't experience that pandemic in their infant experience. And we do find some changes, both sort of potentially positive and potentially negative. So one interesting thing is that sadness, so how often baby cries or seems sad, actually seem to drop from before to after the pandemic. So that's quite interesting, and that might actually reflect potentially the fact that a lot of children had, you know, a nice time at home and did enjoy being with their parents and had lots of positive experiences. So we might be seeing some of those effects. But we also see perceptual sensitivity, which is, you know, how much does your baby notice an airplane or a loud noise, or, you know, a tactile, you know, sort of touch being different, has really jumped, particularly in the younger infants. And it's possible that that's to do with having this more restricted range of experiences, meaning that, you know, now you're suddenly out in the world, everything seems louder and brighter and more difficult to deal with. So that's something that we'll be tracking. And then the other interesting thing was in the older infants, vocalization seemed to have dropped and a little bit smiling. So again, it might be that we're starting to see some of these early impacts of having less experience with people, you know, having less social experience, no mom and baby groups, that maybe we're seeing slightly less vocal engagement from babies than we'd expect. And again, we'll look at how this plays out long term. This might be a temporary shift that will resolve itself, but we're going to keep following these kids to figure that out. So just in summary, I think, you know, what we're seeing is that the pandemic impacted our families in multiple ways, and it may be that there are some downstream effects on child behavior that may be good, may be bad. We don't know that yet, but we're going to keep following these children to figure out, you know, how much this might have longer term impacts. And just to say thank you to all of the families who participate in our studies. They've been amazing to keep engaging with us, you know, through these really challenging times. And thanks to all our funders as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. It was really interesting, and thank you. I was just thinking, there are so many subtypes of autism, and this group you said was had a common trait, or it's just general diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Being home with a verbal child or a complete number, it can change quite a lot.
It's a great question. Yeah, and we have a real range of families. So some families do have older kids who are really profoundly affected, who require, you know, really intensive one-on-one support. And for those families, often that just stopped in March, and then, you know, eventually things might start to pick up again. But for those families, I think it was a profound impact. And then for other families, their child is more able, but often if they have both autism and ADHD, you know, they might be very active. They really need that physical activity, and, you know, things like the playgrounds being shut for those families were hugely impactful. And some of that started to get addressed, you know, a little bit later on. But yeah, so I think there's very different impacts depending on your sort of circumstances and, you know, how your child's affected.
I see. And maybe zooming out of the specific study, do you think there is something that general public can take on, and sort of a suggestion, a practical suggestion even, in terms of supporting the invisible challenges and the invisible challenges, sometimes visible, but not always. So there is a sort of public responsibility sometimes, but it's not always so clear, and very often there is a sense of either embarrassment or a sense of not really knowing what to do somehow, which can then perhaps impact that need of social interactions that you have. And I was
absolutely. So I definitely think being as understanding as possible, you know, so if you see a child in the supermarket who's having a really hard time, you know, people do really react differently. Some people are really and often other parents will sort of recognize that they've experienced that too, and can be very empathic, but other people perhaps don't really understand, you know, why a child might find something difficult that they themselves wouldn't find difficult. So I think in general, you know, understanding that children with different skills or different difficulties are going to experience environments differently, and so they might find something difficult that you wouldn't necessarily think is. So then, you know, a flickering light might be something to them that's really upsetting, whereas to you, you know, we don't notice that. So trying to sort of see the world through their eyes and just trying to be as empathic as possible for both their own difficulties, but also, you know, what they've probably gone through in the last 2 years is probably going to have impacted them more than, you know, for other people who maybe like being at home or had an easier setting. So I think mainly it's just about trying to see things through other people's perspectives as much as we can.
that always helps, doesn't it?
Mm.
Not only with I can see. Thank you. And the other thing that I was thinking, you mentioned on how sometimes signs are shown very early on in life, as in almost prenatively.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any protective something, either action, or is there anything that parents can just keep in mind as a protective action or a protective tool in this sense? Or
yeah, I think the main thing is just adapting to your individual child, which most parents do, you know, without even thinking about it, but just making sure that, you know, that you try to give your child social experiences in the way that they feel that they want them, that they're comfortable with. So for some children, you know, they might not like one activity, but they'll engage in another one, or they'll have a particularly strong interest in something. And if you can get into their interest, then they'll happily engage with you around that. So I think it's about just trying to figure out where there are those chances to connect with your child and give them those sorts of learning experiences in a way that they're ready to receive, I guess. So looking out for those little moments where, you know, they want you to tell them about something, or they want your attention. You know, it can be really hard because we're all really busy, but I think that's the main thing at the moment, that the research suggests that actually it's about finding a way of giving children those learning opportunities where you can. And then obviously some children will be just much more profoundly affected and need a lot more external support. And so the other side of it is just being aware that, you know, if you need to get some external help and accessing health visitors or GPs, you know, and making sure that you're explaining to them, you know, what your child's needs are. At the moment, I think that's the sort of best that one can do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It makes sense. And the last thing that I was thinking was how great it is to see this approach and these studies, and how the aim would seem to be recognizing the path that is changing before it changes. There is a sense of, if I understood well, there is really an identifying aim. And at the same time, as adults, we know that our generation and the one that came before us, there were less tools in order to diagnose, and some people are just living without even perhaps entirely recognizing the difficulties sometimes, or the challenges that a hidden form of autism or a borderline situation can bring. And I was wondering, in terms of sort of either acknowledging, or if there is anything you can say on this difference of diagnosis, basically, that impacts the generations. So in a way, there is an amazing support that is coming to the new generations from a generation that didn't get that much support, in a way, and it's quite.
Completely, yeah. I mean, there are huge differences. There's lots of adults that now are being diagnosed in adulthood who often say that, you know, had they known that earlier, they would have understood their trajectory very differently. And, you know, often adults will talk about, you know, they blame themselves, or other people blame them for their, you know, the fact they couldn't sit still in class, or the fact they weren't like the other children. But having the diagnosis made them feel much more that was, you know, part of them, and that was a valid way of being. And there's all sorts of things around, you know, how it impacts your self-worth and self-understanding, that adult generations just sort of haven't had. So I think it has got a lot better. I think what hasn't got a lot better is some of the support that you can access after you have a diagnosis. That's still something that needs a lot of work. But yes, certainly we're recognizing autism much more and much earlier than we were before.
And the very last thing that I would like to touch on, and then I will let you go, I'm very aware of time, is that you touched twice on the fact that there are strengths in the autistic spectrum. Sometimes they get completely overcome, because of course there are challenges. But when you mention those strengths, what is it exactly that you are thinking?
Yeah, I mean, and it really, again, there's many individual differences, but some children or adults will have an ability to focus much more than other kids might. So they can become, an expert in things or learn within their area of interest much more readily than other kids can. So there's things around focus and things around just seeing things differently. If you're working in a team and you have people who can see a situation differently to you, that's always beneficial in terms of expanding the range of solutions. So often things like that just autistic people can sometimes come from a different perspective that helps everybody see things in a sort of broader way, or see new solutions that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So yeah, that's just a couple, but there's all sorts of, some autistic people are exceptional artists, have this real eye for detail. Some kids read really early, so are amazing at sort of reading letters and words and pick that up really fast. So yeah, it really varies. It's just really important to see that there's this, there's challenges, but there's also strengths that we can build on and kids can use.
It goes down to individuality. Sorry.
Exactly.
Yes, a very tailored almost relationship to every single either challenge or strength. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you so much. It was really interesting listening to you, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy rewatching it. It remains saved on the page. And I wish you a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. See you next time.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.